Thanks for tuning into the Bigwater podcast. We've got longtime friend Travis Hartman. He's like the fisheries guru. He's got all the numbers. You want to know how many walleyes are in Lake Erie? Stay tuned. We're going to talk perch. We're going to talk about all kinds of crazy stuff. Travis Hartman on the Bigwater podcast. Welcome back to another Bigwater podcast. Ross Robertson, we're talking fishing. Of course, that's what we do. We're going to talk some stuff that's fun, not fun. Sometimes it's that not fun stuff, though, that really helps you get the fun stuff going, isn't it, Travis?
Did I just get a nickname? Am I not fun now?
Not fun, Travis Hartman, right here. Tell us, I don't even know your title. I've known you for quite a while, but what exactly is Travis Hartman's day job?
I work for the Division of Wildlife and Lake Erie Program Administrator, so I get to oversee all the Lake Erie fisheries work that we do here in Ohio.
NF, not fun.
Not fun at all.
No, but it's pretty darn important.
It is rewarding. I'll say that.
That's pretty darn important. So, I guess a little background, I saw you Lake Erie Walleye Trail doing different things. And as I've traveled back in the early days in tournaments and things, you go to a lot of different places. And some of the, I don't want to say fisheries guys, DNR guys, those different branches, I know I kind of rope them all into one. I know they're definitely not.
Right.
But us fishermen tend to rope those guys all into one category, right? And you're probably rolling your eyes already. But, and some of those guys really get, they get a bad rap. And sometimes I think they get the rap that they deserve. There's in some places, the mismanagement and different things going on. And, kudos to you and obviously the guy before you that you guys actually fish. And it's amazing how many times, guys are in these roles and you're like, oh, what kind of boat do you use? Or, hey, what's your biggest walleye? Yeah, I don't fish. And you're like, are you kidding me? And it's funny, but it's a reality. You know what I mean?
But I really appreciate that because most of the people in our field started in the field because of interest in fishing, obviously. Whether it was fishing in a stream near your home or fortunate to go out here on Lake Erie and fish for walleye. Most of us do have roots in the fishing, the fun of fishing, fishing with family. But you're right. I mean, doing it on Lake Erie, in a tournament setting, it's kind of a different level. So,
I didn't say he was good at it, but he likes to do it.
I wouldn't argue that either.
But in all seriousness, it's like I know guys in the rep world, in the fishing rep world, and they don't fish, and I'm just like, how can you be good at your job? Like I couldn't sell cosmetics or handbags, and if you're not, like I would think there'd be other places you could make more money. Like,
right. Well, that's not actually the word on the street. I've heard that you could sell, ice to Alaskan, right? But
I take that as a compliment. I take that as a compliment.
No, I get what you're saying, though, and I appreciate it. We Division of Wildlife are fortunate. We have a lot of passionate people, and almost all of them fish for sure. And
you got your son now into that, quite a few years. And I can remember back and fishing against you in some derbies way back in the day. It is a lot longer ago than we think.
I don't like to admit that.
Fishing with your dad earlier on there, and it's good. Aside from what we're talking about, it's good family time, and obviously getting the next generation in because that's super important. We talked with some hunting guys and different things, and hearing about the numbers going down and participation. Kids on these games all the time. They don't want to get out. I see it in my boat as a guide. You get the kid on there, and we're catching giant walleyes, and the kid's like, I got one more Instagram message to send. And I'm like, it's just exhausting.
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned that because that's a huge issue facing state agencies right now, and quite honestly, fishing and hunting industry as a total, because we're losing our stakeholders and we're not replacing them at the same rate we're losing them.
So, I know this maybe isn't exactly your deal, but do you know the numbers on license holders in Ohio? Are we holding? Are we dropping? Are we dropping crazy?
What's really interesting is in Ohio, we have around 2 million fishing license buyers. But one of the issues is frequency. They're not all the people that go fishing don't fish every year. So we only sell around 700,000 or 800,000 licenses a year, but we have 2 million license buyers. So we got to look at ways to keep people engaged, keep them fishing, get them out every year compared to every third year, fifth year. There are long-term implications for reduced license sales, and they have to be addressed.
We'll get into these because I got a few things to pry on you a little bit, to be honest. But with the millions of fish that we have now, it probably helps. I think.
Absolutely.
You just look at you fish a lot yourself. I see you in the weekends and the parking lot and that. When you look at these, basically, let's say March and April out here, when I go down I don't care if it's 7 in the morning or 7 at night, there are way less Ohio license plates in the parking lots at the major state facilities or even private ramps. You've got Iowa, you've got South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I mean, there are people coming from all over here, to take this resource, because the reality is a bad day in Lake Erie is still a good day just about everywhere else.
We're very fortunate. We have a regionally incredible resource here. And it's kind of interesting that the perception is all the non-resident anglers come in March and April. And obviously, like you just mentioned, you go to the ramps, a high proportion are out of state. But believe it or not, the based on numbers, the number of anglers, number of hours, it's actually May, June, July that the most out-of-state anglers are here.
I believe that. And that's probably when they start going on 6-pack trips and they're going on other things, or kids are out of school is another big one. Yep. I just see it because these are guys that I know, even personally know, that are from South Dakota. Like, they got ice, or they can't work, seasonal guys. So they come here when it's almost like January or February for us.
Or they have closed seasons in their home state.
A lot of closed seasons, river only, all kinds of regulations. But I guess the one thing that I would have to I'll pick on you a little bit, even though it's way before your time, but what stops me is, I can remember as a kid, them saying that the estimates, and again, I take these things with a grain of salt, no offense. I think it was like, when I was a kid, 75 million walleyes or whatever. And again, where we've come, and this is where you're gonna set me straight for sure. It's just like anything. You look back 20 years and you're like, can you believe we used that and actually bought into that? Or can you believe that that's how we gauge this? And, whatever it was, 25 years ago, I'm going to say roughly, I can remember them using helicopters just like they would for speed traps. And they were marking, like, you go out in the Western Basin and there was 3 or 4 schools. That's what there was. They were 20 feet deep. They were 2 miles by 3 miles, and it was, hey, the North Pod, or whatever you call it. You go out there, and there'd be 8 billion boats. You don't, like, nowadays there's pods. I mean, you see 10 boats here, 5 boats here, 2 here, 1 here. Hopefully me, 1 all by myself over there. But the reality is back then with those giant schools and those guys kind of not following the migration like we do now, but definitely still following. How do you really get an interpretation for what the numbers? I mean, you've even got to kind of roll your eyes a little bit. Like, if you're using a helicopter, I mean, the misinformation, it's the best we had at the time. But I mean, just like electronics and stuff. I mean, look what we got now with side imaging. You can't blame a 1980s Hummingbird because what we've got now with side imaging.
Absolutely.
So at the time, it's the best we had. But I mean, what do you really feel that those numbers even mean?
So you think about decades ago versus now. Honestly, the biggest change is the amount of data. So we were honestly doing some of the same techniques that we're doing now. So we have harvest assessments of what anglers harvest, what commercial netters up in Ontario harvest. We have surveys that we do that we get estimates of numbers of fish. And go back 30 years ago, we were actually doing some of the same things we're doing now, but we only had 5, 10, 15 years worth of data going into it. So as you build these data sets, you really have strength in our estimates. And along with that, we've continued to refine the process. So we're using higher tech modeling techniques now that are handling the data more appropriately. But honestly, what I take a lot of comfort is when you look back, the trends in the population look very similar to what they did back then. Maybe those absolute estimates have changed. Maybe how many walleye we had in 1988 looks a little different than it did back then when we were estimating it. But the trends are the same. We had a ton of walleye in the 80s, and it declined through the 90s, and those trends still hold up in the current estimates.
And again, this is not like pouring out a cup full of pennies and being able to count them. Right. I mean, you can call bullshit. I mean,
and you're as right as I am.
Either way, there's nobody's right. I think as a guide through the year, there's been several years where I'm kind of like, come on now, hold up, because you just go through and like I feel again, it's total feel, and there's I'm not saying I'm right, but you're like, when those numbers were going down, it got tougher to catch fish.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're like, man, there ain't the fish that there used to be. And
and you were right about one aspect of that. And you think about, so what we're estimating is Lake Erie's walleye population. But built into that is how many young fish there are, how many middle-aged fish, how many old fish. The Western Basin and even into the western waters of the Central Basin is very dependent on good young year classes. So as that population declined in the 90s, we weren't getting the big hatches we got in the 80s. All of a sudden you have an older based population that's highly migratory. So if you went out here in the Western Basin around the islands, even in the early 90s when the population numbers were pretty good, it was getting worse in a hurry. because those young fish weren't staying here. They weren't around the islands because we didn't have those good year classes backing up these older fish.
So let's back up just a hot minute. I mean, we're sitting on the shores of Lake Erie right now. For somebody that's not in Ohio or maybe doesn't fish here, the migrations, like I don't think, like I got buddies, fish Mille Lacs, they're like, oh, the walleye factory. I'm like, yeah, you got 250,000 fish. Like we have that behind my door. But the migrations are literally, I mean, just explain from western to central to eastern, actually the volume of what happens.
And I think that's what makes Lake Erie so interesting. That's why
it's a highway.
Every year is different. Every month's different. If you go to a Wisconsin or Minnesota walleye lake, even a decent sized one, you're fishing structure, right? You're fishing a point, a reef, and maybe there's 10 spots on your lake, and each day you fish all 10. Of course, fish move around those points, their activity changes. Here on Lake Erie, you're talking about millions of acres of water, and fish don't observe boundaries, state boundaries, international boundaries. If you fish out of a certain marina or a ramp, you might have the best fishing in the world for a month or two, and then those fish move on, and they're not coming back until the conditions dictate it again.
Them walleyes are kind of like that college buddy that owes you $500.
You're not going to find them.
You can't find them.
That's right.
You can't find them. I can remember early like PWT things when we still had those bigger schools instead of like millions of pods, and those guys would go out and everybody weighed within a half a pound of each other, and somebody got one or two bigger ones. Mm-hmm. But the reality was these guys were fishing these schools, and like you could see the weights the next day where everyone's like, well, what happened? Mm-hmm. They moved, and everybody's driving 5 miles this way, 5 miles that way, and they're like, our lake isn't that big at home. Like, what do you do? And
it's a different scale. You can look at seasonal migrations. We have fish leaving the lake. We have western basin spawning fish that'll go up to the St. Clair River or southern Lake Huron. You have western basin fish that'll be in Buffalo in August. It's a big open lake, and while the individual daily movements can be huge, the seasonal movements are even bigger.
Let's not jump over that too quick because I can remember, you tell me the exact thing, but I remember some guys in the Maumee River saying that those fish was at Saginaw Bay or something they came from.
We have a lot of interesting theories. And
look at a map before you to ponder that.
We actually, it's interesting, some of the things we've seen in the new tagging studies. We have fish that spawn in the Maumee River that spend most of the year in the Detroit River. So that to me is something we never would have assumed. Why would a Detroit River fish, a riverine fish, leave that river to spawn in a different river in the Maumee and then return to live in Detroit River all year? So there are a lot of dynamics going on. There's movement into the lake and back out. There's lake spawning fish that move within the lake. It really is a highway, like you said earlier, and it's multi-directional.
And I'm going to go to the guy before you in that position. He crazier than a corn crib rat, as he would say. Old Jeffro, he was a hoot, wasn't he? And now he's big time. He left us. Now he's in charge of everybody.
Yeah, Jeff's up at the Fish Commission doing Great Lakes wide stuff.
So funny story with him. I called him one day, and I want to say that this is before like texting and all that stuff. This is quite a while ago. And I caught a fish.
He still has a flip phone, by the way.
Yeah, I do not doubt that. I don't doubt that whatsoever. God, we love you, Jeff. Somebody's got to. But crazier than a corn crib rat. That's one of my favorites. But any rate, I called him up, and it was like Sunday. He's getting ready to go to church. And I had known Jeff a very long time. I don't know if I've heard him curse a whole lot, but I got him to do about 3 or 4 times in a row. So I can give you a little insight how to do that. And I gave him the jaw tag number like 5 times. Yeah. And he said, give it to me one more time. I said, Jeff, come on now. Because that fish had been tagged like 30 days or something prior, and I don't remember exactly, on Thunder Bay, Lake Huron. And we caught that fish down in it was literally like 30, 40 days, and we caught that down near Huron.
Yep.
And it was like October, and that fish was banded. I can't remember when. It was like August, September, something like that.
Sure.
But anyway, you do some quick math here, not as the crow flies, but just some quick over here, up here. That thing traveled hundreds of miles, and you're like, why? That's one thing we can kind of put some of these numbers together, but do you think you're any closer to understanding, like, what the hell?
I'll never claim to be in the head of a walleye, but I will say, you think about the history of the Great Lakes, the environmental change, the pollution, the recovery. The reason we still have walleye is they're so diverse genetics, diverse behaviors, just like people.
People don't leave the house. People can't be in the house, right?
That's right. And, you think about everything Lake Erie's been through. We wouldn't have walleye if they weren't diverse. If we didn't have lots of genetic groups and spawning stocks and different migration patterns. a single migration pattern alone can determine your risk at mortality, your risk of being caught. If you go up north, there's a chance you get caught in a gill net. If you stay around the islands, there's a good chance you're getting caught by an angler. If you go up to Lake St. Clair, there's a whole different set of concerns, maybe even predation by muskie. So what your group of fish does determines, how long it survives.
And if you remember, I want to say it's about 5 years ago, so roughly 15 years later, whatever, give or take. I called you up from the boat. I had some guys that were super cool. We were on a guide trip, and we had one of those, looks like a CO2 cylinders. You could see it looked like someone did a real primitive gut job on them there.
I'll have to pass that back to the surgeons.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it looked like a baseball mitt. I was thinking we were in Vegas and somebody got knocked out and they stole their kidney or something. Called the cops. But in all seriousness, I mean, I won't say which little rock pile because it's one of my favorites, but don't you either.
Right.
But at any rate, you said, no, keep that. We want to harvest that. We want that back. And
Absolutely.
I don't know if things have changed since then with how that's done. But the reality is you gave me this overlay and you're like, this fish did like an X sketch just,
Yep.
and he went over here for a little bit. And this thing was a homebody.
Mm-hmm.
He did not go far pretty much the whole year. He must have spawned right near that, that rock pile shoal, whatever you want to call it, and on and off. And you just think about that other one.
Yeah.
Similar fish, similar size, everything. And you're like, well, it's like people.
Went hundreds of miles. Yeah.
Yeah. So you never really can figure the whole thing out.
Well, I'm going to use that opportunity too to point out, you just brought up our biggest change in tagging technology, which is really a cool thing. We now are using acoustic telemetry tags. So it's a sonar technology. We put AA battery size tags.
I'm glad I didn't have to say that out loud.
It's a AA size tag and it emits a sonar signal. And what we're able to do is put receivers all around the lake. So in the past, we put a jaw tag on. You mentioned that jaw tag number you're reading off to Jeff. And that gave us great information. We knew where we tagged it, and then when it got reported, we knew where it got captured and when. But we didn't know anything in between. So that was that was the next big question. What are they doing between tagging time and recapture time? What does the migration look like? And we have a huge network now of receivers all over the lake. And anytime these fish with the tag swim by it, we get a location and a date and time of when that fish was there. So we can look at the whole movement history.
So in layman's terms, they basically have some anchored down receivers on the bottom of the lake, and they're spread out to a point that you're going to basically not overlap, but you're going to catch them no matter where they swim.
Yep.
It's like a home monitoring system. You got your little ankle bracelet.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
Get yourself in trouble, boom, we got you.
Yep. And we're seeing some really interesting migration patterns based on that. And one of the reasons to report it is some of those tags do have depth sensors and temperature sensors built into the tag. So when you capture that fish and you harvest it and clean it and get the tag and send it back to us, you not only get the $100 reward, which is distinctly a reason to keep it.
Hey, did you keep mine?
What $100?
Yeah, exactly.
But it gets us a whole lot more information. So not only now do we have all that detection data from the receivers that we already had access to, but now we know in the water column where that fish was like every hour of the whole year. We know what the temperature of water that fish was in, and we can start putting these layers on and really understanding what these fish are doing.
So it works on pressure for
Absolutely.
how deep they are, and obviously the movements, and it records essentially everything about that fish.
Yep.
So let's get back to again, for people who don't live here that don't really understand, give me the migration year round. Maybe we should use cities or something or whatever.
Yeah.
As far as how far these fish are moving and when they do it.
The most common...
And probably for not all the fish.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are so many groups of fish and different migration patterns by group. But generally speaking, if you're talking about the Lake Erie walleye population and the core of our fish that we follow around and harvest every year, they're going to start out in the western basin in the spring, and spawning time they're off of Camp Perry. So Davis Betsy Power Plant, Camp Perry Firing Range, they're there spawning in our natural reefs. We're
Toledo, west of the Bass Islands.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a big area, but right in there.
So they're in the western basin, March, April, into early May they're spawning, and within that, the males are sitting on the reefs. They're hanging out at the bar looking for the females that are coming in to spawn.
Okay.
And you can watch with the tagging. It's really cool. You can watch those males swim around the reefs for 2 months, and they're on those reefs. That's what they're doing for 2 months. They're there to spawn. And then you have the females that sit off the reefs, and when the time is right for that individual female, they come in and drop their eggs. Past that point is when all the condition-dependent behavior starts. So as the water warms up, yeah, fish start moving to the east. But the most common migration path is to spawn in the west and then start moving towards the east as the water warms up. And that's where every year can be different. You get an early, really warm, Memorial Day and early summer. Those fish are going to start leaving and heading to the central basin in a hurry. So all of a sudden they're at Huron, Vermilion, Avon, and they'll get to Cleveland late May, early June some years if it's really hot.
And the thing that I've kind of found, just to tell me if the stats go with this, it's usually the biggest fish that go first.
Absolutely. Those biggest fish, the biggest, oldest females that a lot of us are fishing for and want a chance to catch a trophy, they're the ones that tend to react the quickest to the water temperatures and the conditions.
So early spring working into summer. So summer ports, where's probably the bulk of that population of the fish that do go?
In a normal year, the Huron to Lorraine area is really good, late May and really all the way through June. So you can kind of watch these bigger fish. They'll spread out around the islands. As it starts getting warmer, then they start moving into that deeper central basin water, looking for cooler water and food. And May and June can really be good anywhere from the islands to Lorraine. So
Cleveland, Ashtabula, some of those, and back in the day when you had like Fairport Harbor, obviously Geneva, Ashtabula, Conneaut, are we seeing the biggest fish there because of food? I mean, it's the temperature, has that got something to do with it?
My sense is the temperature that's driving them. So if it stays cool, you might have those bigger fish linger for a while and still be around Lorraine in late June. But if it gets warm quick, by mid-June, you can see that Geneva, Fairport, east of Cleveland fishing really pick up.
And how much, I guess it's an opinion thing like anything we're talking about, but the reality is I don't think that the walleyes are like, hey, we can't survive in this temperature. Does a lot of that become that those biggest fish are eating smelt, rainbow dace, or something that they're affected by the temperature? Like they can't hang out with that? Gizzard shad maybe as we get back into the colder water periods? Or?
So you get into the physiology, what the fish need, what the individuals require. So, female uses a lot of energy. She's got to build those eggs, and then after she spawns, she's got to recover and start building eggs again. The females really need that cool water. So it's always been my assumption they're staying in the right water temperature, which takes them down to the central basin. Then once they get there, they have the resources like smelt and emerald shiners and even yellow perch and gobies and things like that. But they're moving down there for the cool water, and then they utilize the best food sources there.
So when do you think when's kind of that turn? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear what the markers say.
60 to 65 degrees, so they're going to be heading out of town. They're going to be looking for that, trying to stay in that temperature range.
One thing I guess I don't know if I've ever even asked you this, we talked quite a bit, is the, let's say September. We don't have, that's where I think a lot of these fish start kind of deciding, okay, we're in turn, or also the ones that stay back on the western end, they seem to do things different as far as location, depth of water, all that good stuff. We don't really have a turnover here, do we, compared to like a Lake Michigan or Lake Ontario? Or
Central Basin does. If you look at just the geometry of the Central Basin, actually before humans, we still had a thermocline in the Central Basin. You get water below that gets cut off from the surface water. So you have cold water and the oxygen gets depleted. So you end up with this cold oxygenless water mass that's below the thermocline.
Dead zone.
Dead zone. We like to call it, dead zone. And people talk about hypoxia. If you look at the articles surrounding the dead zone and scientists start talking about hypoxia, the reality is it's a separate water mass.
And so, I use a fish hawk, which has a temperature whole deal. You can see all that's a speed sensor too. But when you put that down in that thermocline, often it's about, I'd say, if I had to pick a number, I'd say 40 feet.
40 to 50 can be year dependent, season dependent, but yeah, you get below 40 feet away.
But again, nowadays there's so many easy ways that, like I said, dropping a fish hawk down, you can tell in 5 seconds. But you're generally going to want to fish just above that.
Just above it, because at most the fish will get down into it and kind of sit in it, but there's no oxygen below it from July on. So they can't go down into it. They won't be below that thermocline. So if you're in the thermocline or below it, you're below the fish and they're not seeing your lures.
So do you think that causes some of those fish to say, screw this noise, let's start heading back, where you don't maybe get more closer towards Lorraine west, where you don't, where is the border you think you actually see thermocline?
It's as close to the west as east of Kelly's Island. So you get east of Kelly's Island into 45 feet of water, and a lot of times in late July, early August, there'll be a thermocline, there'll be no oxygen below 40 feet. And, as soon as you're east of Kelly's, you're into that deeper water, and it's possible.
And I've seen, I don't know, maybe off the top of your head, I've seen different apps and things online where they show these dead zones.
Absolutely.
And some of them are, like you said, they're basically between Vermilion, like west of the Sandbar, north of Huron, quite a ways, kind of triangulating with east of Kelly's.
Yep.
And it's just like a giant area of and you go out there and it's
dead water.
It's just dead.
Yeah. So you can actually almost see a line on your sonar a lot of times. That can arise from the plankton will sit on that thermocline. So you're actually marking that thick layer of plankton that's sitting on that water density change. But the reality is it allows you to see it on the sonar. So you'll kind of get a faint line or even a hard line at 40, 45 feet, and you won't see a single fish hook below that. You don't need an oxygen sensor, right? I mean, as nice as your fish hawk is, you see that on your sonar, and you've already eliminated water.
Well, yeah, you don't have to put it down. You can see it at 30 miles an hour.
Yep.
For sure. Mm-hmm. So these things are turning back, and they basically, in let's say winter time, I mean, a lot of people realize these fish are starting to form the eggs already.
Oh, absolutely.
If not already, some of the bigger ones like really well into it. Mm-hmm. And they're staging outside these areas, right? Yep. So, I mean, I've seen them caught, even just fishing myself when we get these mild winters, let's say Vermilion, occasionally Lorraine, Huron, and then stacking up around the Bass Islands. Those fish are basically just like, all right, we're getting ready to do business, even though we've got a long wait. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of just, I don't want to say hibernating, but they don't tend to move nearly as much. If there was one time they're not moving, that would be it, right?
Yep. I like to say the fish are better meteorologists than we are. And your fishing experience, you can probably confirm this. Every year the fall fishing is a little different. When are the big fish in Huron? Those true 9 to 12 pounders. They used to be September and October, you get a shot at those big fish. They'd be coming back. And those are the years that by, first week of December, there's skim ice, or there's the first big snowstorm that's really getting cold. Lately, we've had mild falls. The water temperature stayed up, and we don't get a chance at those biggest fish off Huron until November, December, even now in January, February. They're just now starting to show up in numbers, and that's totally conditions dictated.
So as these fish move back and they're staging basically through the winter, guys are ice fishing them or maybe in a boat or whatever, and then they're going to we kind of come back to full circle, spawning, west of the islands, generally speaking, even though I've caught fish, milking for sure. They thought they were spawning or something down on the rock piles down in Huron, Vermilion, that main lake shoreline stuff. So, I mean, there seems, I can mean back in the day, Jim Foffridge, he kind of was one of the guys that broke out and said, hey, these things are spawning out in the Maumee Bay sand flats because as the zebra mussels came in, it was creating a hard enough bottom. And I don't know what the productivity of the spawn was there, but there was a ton of fish spawning on those harder bottoms. I mean, is it just one of those deals that they're looking for some fresh real estate, for lack of a better term?
Well, and think about it in the population sense, the more fish there are, the more saturated or the more individuals there are on the best spawning habitat. So what do you do if you show up where you want to spawn and there's just too many fish, there's too much activity? You start looking for other areas that have similar conditions. So, you get into 10 to 20 feet of water, find some good hard bottom, ideally, rock or gravel or something. And chances are in Lake Erie, there's some spawning activity there. And I think one of the changes we're really noticing is there's a distinct possibility that central basin spawning is occurring, and we're actually seeing production from it. So when we do trawls off of Cleveland and Fairport and Lorraine, we're seeing small young year walleye early in the year that clearly didn't migrate there. The fish this size didn't migrate from Maumee Bay to Cleveland in a month or two. They're pretty much staying, wherever the current takes them.
Well, we'll pick on Jeff again, Corn Crib Rat, crazy, because he's not here.
That's easy when he's not here.
Love you, Jeff. He told me back, this is way back. This is not 20 years ago, but it's darn close. Mm-hmm. That they felt that there was different, and I think there's validity to it. That's why I bring it up, just again by my fishing end of it. I don't claim these are factual things, but just seems to be true. He told me in so many words that like there was different, I don't know if you'd say classes of fish where they're spawning. Again, most of the bigger ones are going to spawn first. Like here we are, and we're going to get out. But then also like the ones that were going in Sandusky Bay, generally speaking, were a bigger grade of fish, or the bloodlines. And there's like the Canadian bloodlines. There's the ones to the west. And certain places just had flat out bigger fish, and they were, seeing this, obviously guys catching them, snagging them, or, putting them in the shock, deal.
Sure.
And is that still fairly acceptable?
Absolutely. If you look at based on tagging information, based on new genetic techniques that we're starting to look at groups of fish based on genetics, based on tagging migration routes. Each spawning group of fish has different behaviors, and with that, they potentially have different average size, average weight, or length to weight relationships. That, like you've mentioned a few times already, kind of like, how people are different, and some families have tall individuals, and some families have shorter individuals. Yeah, and my son's taller than me now, by the way. But
Sure.
You see some of the same dynamics play out in genetics and fish populations. And you mentioned Sandusky Bay fish. Those fish tend to turn right and go east as quick as any. That group of fish really migrates to the east in a hurry, and it has big fish. So that individual group of fish is important to the Central Basin sport fishery.
I'm not going to ask you how many walleyes are in the lake, because I feel that's like the most loaded, just ridiculous
Right.
question on the planet. There's a shit pile. That's what the answer would be, shit pile. But how many of those proportion, let's not say a number, but let's say percentage-wise, that are doing this migration versus those kind of like dormant fish? Because the reality is I think numbers stand up that the most sport fishing boats or guides or charters, whatever you want to call them, they're out of the Western Basin to the west end of the Central Basin, like an overwhelming amount of the fishing guys. And they're obviously they're taking a majority of the sport fishing catch. And even the Canadian net boats, generally speaking, we're going to be,
Western half of the lake.
Point Pelee, Huron, West. I mean, that's where they're doing their business. So what percentage of those fish, generally the smaller ones, are staying there and not making that migration?
It's interesting, and I could go back and look at the specific results of our tagging and give you actual pretty close percentages.
We're going to hold you to it. So.
Right. The reality is about 25% of the fish go all the way to the Eastern Basin. So we're talking New York, Pennsylvania, or Eastern Pennsylvania, New York, and Ontario waters in the Eastern Basin. So around a quarter, 25% of the Western Basin fish make it all the way down there.
That's probably higher than I thought.
Yeah, and it was somewhere from 50 to 75%. I think it's closer to 75% of the fish that leave the West. So maybe they don't make it all the way down to the Eastern Basin, but they get into the Central Basin. So it's less than 25% of the fish that stay in the West. And within those are some of the fish that go up north to the Detroit River and Lake Huron. And you're probably down at a 10 to 15% range that just don't leave the West.
That's not the number.
But again, that's the migrating adults. Then you add into that the young fish that aren't migrating. Most female walleye don't migrate until they're around 4 years old, as far as large scale migrations. So they might move around within the West. They might get into the Central Basin if conditions dictate. But for the most part, the Western Basin fishing is after the spawn is really dictated by how many young fish, how big the year classes are that are less than 4 years old.
And it's so easy to be cynical in this.
No.
That the reality is again, it's not that I distrust any of your information, but when you look back at what was the acceptable thing 5, 10, or 20 years ago, you kind of go, oh my God, I can't believe we use that. But you've got to use what science at the time. I mean, just like people getting cases overturned with DNA.
Sure.
You did the best you could at the time, but the reality of walleyes is like you don't ever really know what's happening, and they seem to, like you said, in the fall there's certain years where you're just like, man, they didn't come back 6 weeks difference, and as a guide, I'm like,
that's
oh,
a huge deal.
It's a problem. And I guess the one thing that, do we have a firm handle, or where you're somewhat confident in answering this without kind of doing a wink and a eye roll with, I've seen a lot of these big fish and you catch them, they got eggs in them, and it's June. Okay.
Right.
And I tell people this, and it's from you and Jeff. This is that. I always tell
You're
everybody.
blaming me again.
I tell everybody I'm just a dumb fishing guy. That's what I do. Occasionally shoot a TV show or podcast. But the reality is, I put you on the block, and I say, okay, what do you mean this fish is? A guy will mount one and say, hey man, taxidermist said this thing was full of eggs in June. Like it didn't spawn yet.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, some of those giant fish, I think it was either you or Jeff. They gave the analogy of it's like an 80-year-old woman trying to give birth, and they reabsorb these eggs, use them like a protein shake, and they don't spawn every
year.
I mean, what is 2, 3?
So the reality is we're just now learning more details about the situation like that because of these acoustic tags. So we can tag a female, and even if she doesn't get recaptured, for the next 4 years, we can see, does she come back to the spawning grounds? Is she spawning in the same place? if she stays out in the middle of the central basin, it's pretty fair to assume she's not spawning. So those are the fish that you're talking about, the ones that still have eggs in June. We don't have a percent of females that don't spawn each year. We don't have a good estimate of that. So I'll throw out 10, 15% maybe don't spawn. It'd be rare to see more than one fish out of 10 that didn't have eggs in June, right? I mean, it's likely less than 10%.
And I like to do a certain thing, which so I'm not going to tell everybody because you got to figure this out yourself. But I found some things where I can catch bigger fish, when there's not a lot around, because we just don't have the numbers of big fish that we used to. And there's a couple things that I do, and it seems that and I'm talking more location thing than even technique, sure. But and me and you have done this together. We'll just leave it at that. But there are specific areas and things that you can do that you tend to catch fish that haven't spawned for whatever reason. Generally, they're bigger, so that's why I like going after them. Just get a picture taker.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to see me take a picture with a 19-incher. I mean, I'm tall, not like this guy. Just small, look big. Yeah, he's 22-incher. It looks like a giant.
Every fish I catch is huge, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's like my buddy John Gilman. Gosh, it makes everything look big. It's so terrible. But is there anything that you guys have found with fish that are? I know you said they're hanging off, so you can't tell did a fish spawn or not. You can just guess because of where the location is. If you're in 50 foot of water, 25 feet down, you're probably not spawning.
Right.
But have you noticed any kind of activity or location things where some of those bigger fish that do kind of just hang out, what they do?
I'd argue we don't have that level of understanding yet. I mean, for all the females we have, it's literally a handful within our tagging data set that we believe didn't spawn in a certain year. So it is a low percentage of the females. And we just don't have enough observations to say, well, look, if they don't spawn, they always go north of Kelly's Island, and we don't know that. That would be pure speculation by me. But it's really interesting to me that they don't just dump the eggs. So I think it's wild that it's more.
Well, I mean, I've had guys that keep them. Not to interrupt you, but I've had guys that keep them and they mount them and I'm like, what are you gonna say? Not my thing to do, but whatever you got to do. And a guy wants to put a giant on the wall that's basically dead anyhow, and it is what it is. But I've seen those eggs where it's like a baseball.
They're disgusting, right?
They're nasty looking.
Yep.
They're not like one of those 22-inchers or 24-inchers. They're hard as a rock. It looks. Yep. It looks like that old silly putty we had as a kid.
Oh yeah, it's terrible. And so it would make sense to me that if conditions weren't right to spawn, even if they stay in the central basin, that they just dump the eggs, right? That it'd be energetically, it'd make more sense. It'd be healthier for the fish to dump the eggs as if they had tried to spawn.
Well, didn't they absorb them to help like a protein shake? I've heard various people say that, and I don't know.
It's the only thing that makes sense. Like, why else? Like, physiologically, why else would you keep those eggs, right? Well, they must regain some nutrition from reabsorbing them. But just from the appearance and I'll even say the smell when you cut those fish open, it's hard to imagine it as healthy, but it must be, right?
I mean, I can tell you through the years on different shallow rock piles that I've seen seagulls, blowing up on stuff, and I'll, move the boat around a little bit. And when you get over there and there's 3 or 4 walleyes that are pecked half to death, and they're, giants, 32, 33, just old giant fish. And seemingly that they were, females and have dumped their eggs, and they probably just didn't make it. Like, they're just...
I mean, think about how stressful spawning is, and those oldest fish are the ones that you likely lose just to natural mortality because of spawning. So they show up on the reefs, they successfully dump their eggs, but it takes so much out of them physiologically that they don't recover. And I'm sure you've caught plenty of those fish, the 32-incher that's the head the size of a 5-gallon bucket, and then it's just a snake, a tiny little skinny body behind it. Probably wasn't going to recover.
I just had one. Funny you should say that. This goes out to my buddy Bob Henlow. Shout at him. So we caught this giant the other day. It was about 32 inches, and it was still a big fish. It was double digits. But I said it's got a head like Bob Henton and it's got a mouth like Ross Robertson. I mean, you could put 2 hands in this thing. And like on Saginaw Bay, we joke about those things. I can remember back in, I want to say the early 2000s to maybe not even that long ago. You'd go out there and you'd catch a 28-incher, and the thing would weigh like 5 pounds. Yeah. They just, they had a forage issue. That's why again, we're getting off topic, but that's why all the salmon and everything basically went over.
A big word for you, forage. I don't know where that came from.
Every now and then, a couple syllables sneaks out. But, on Lake Huron, again, these are things, even though you're a Lake Erie guy, you got to pay attention. And I'm sure you coordinate with these other people because on Lake Huron, all the food's gone. Salmon went around Lake Michigan, like follow the straits around, guys, and boom, that's where they're at. And they're struggling over there. They don't have the, the alewives and things that they used to. You think of on the beaches of Chicago back in the day.
Yeah.
So basically, there is a bunch of walleyes in Lake Huron now, and there is a bunch of lake trout. Yep. And it seems like, smallmouth are kind of coming back too, but the forage just totally changed where these things could not get enough food. I mean, I don't even, what is Michigan's on Lake Huron? Is it like 10 or 12 fish or something? Is the bag limit?
They did increase the bag limit, to increase harvest a little bit to balance the predator and prey a little more.
I mean, there's like these cigars with these like piranha heads on them,
And that's the difference you see within the Great Lakes. Every lake has different issues and different productivity and different prey levels. I mean, the salmon being stocked in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron is one of the biggest fishery success stories you'll find. They had an overabundance of alewives. They stocked a desirable predator to drop those prey numbers down, and they absolutely did. And in the meantime, they created a fishery that all the anglers love.
And I've asked you this privately several times, and I look at you every time like a coach that tells me I could play in the NBA when you give me your answer. And I'm like, is there enough food? Because again, I'm going to make up numbers here. Let's say we had 50 million fish, 20 million, whatever. Let's say 20. That's maybe accurate. Now let's say over 100. Mm-hmm. If you've got 2 kids you got to feed, and you're working the same job, same thing going on. Now all of a sudden you got 8 kids to feed. No. Something's got to give. And I know that you've told me moving on to other things. I won't put words in your mouth, but I mean, I'm scared because I've watched that Saginaw Bay deal. Sure.
Well, you think about on Lake Erie was producing all these walleye. We have very productive waters. The algae blooms have been highly publicized. In the Western Basin, we get these harmful algal blooms And
you mean shallower, more fertile?
Yeah. So
warmer water generally.
We have lots of nutrients coming into the system, and based on the algal blooms, you could say we have too many nutrients coming into the system. Well, these same conditions are allowing us to have successful hatches. Because in the spring, we have lots of plankton. We have all these nutrients. We have plankton blooms, and all the young walleye and perch and everything else that hatch, they have food to eat. It's a very productive system. The production is reflection of how many nutrients are coming in. I'll start to worry when we see fish that aren't in good shape. So, obviously, we talk about you catch that occasional small fish or maybe fish that hasn't produced eggs yet that looks.
I'm not seeing it unhealthy so far.
But you'll get all these 19, 20, 21, 22 inches we have. Now, I was just out Monday. I think you were too, probably. How many skinny 20 inches did you see?
I mean,
not many, right?
We had handled 20-some fish in just a few hours, and I think we only had a couple that were even males, in my opinion, just because the way they were all bloated up. But I mean, even the ones that were males, at least I think that they were healthy fish. Like those things have been feeding. Again, I don't keep a lot of those big fish myself. That's just my personal decision. But obviously, as a guide and doing other things, and probably the biggest thing I see is when we put them in the live well trying to recoup them, or we're doing a photo shoot, taking some pictures. Reality is all of a sudden these things start puking this stuff up, or even just catching fish like on dipsies in the summertime. I watch these things they don't even get in the boat just vomit mode, but now it's these. Again, we had this insane hatch, which we'll get to, but the reality is you've got these walleyes and perch that are, 2-3 inches at best. And I'm catching a 20-incher that got 15, 20. I've got pictures of, on my Facebook and different social media accounts where it looks like someone just threw up all over my boat. Yeah. One 20-inch fish had 15, 20, and you kind of go, ooh, I guess they're going a little cannibal mode on us here.
Yeah, and that's really a reflection of these big hatches we're seeing, because we rarely see walleye eat other walleye. But we've had so many consecutive large hatches that it turns into one of the more abundant small fish in the Western Basin in that time of year, in July, when you're fishing dipsies. What's more abundant than those little walleye after a giant hatch, right? So by default, they're going to eat some of them.
And then, inversely, the big fish that, like I said, I got in the live well trying to get them recouped a little bit. The big ones they can be a heck to release. I've got them in there and they start spitting up like, I'm not sure exactly what they are because some of them are so regurgitated, but I can tell you confidently a lot of times they're white bass or white perch.
White bass, white perch, and gizzard shad.
Yeah, and a lot of this time, we've talked about this, that's not their ideal thing because they're spiny and it's not their preferred thing. Is that accurate?
Right. Well, you think about walleye and any predator fish, and what's going to be the best meal? Well, it's something with soft rays without spines. So you're thinking smelt, gizzard shad, emerald shiners, even gobies. Gobies, a little more effort to get them. You got to go down on the bottom, maybe root around.
You want cheesecake or barbed wire?
Right. But when you have big fish and they're around white perch, white bass, and those fish are the right, 6, 8, 9-inch size, sometimes one big, more difficult meal is less effort than a lot of small ones, right? So it's best return for the least effort, and a white perch swims in front of you, and all of a sudden you're puking it up in Ross's boat 10 minutes later.
Great. I'm happy to have the bites, but come on now, right? Inversely too, talking about like smallmouth stuff, it seems like, and again, I don't know, years go by, I'm not good with those dates and things, but let's say a decade ago, you couldn't hardly drag a jig or a harness or a bottom bounce, I don't care what it was, and not get, zebra mussels, of course, but also gobies.
Yep.
And now, did the smallmouths just eat them up? I've had walleye spit them up too,
You're literally seeing like the invasion dynamics of a new species and the lag time it takes for predators to identify them as a quality food source. When gobies first got here, they showed up in diets, but not often. You didn't see every smallmouth full of gobies. You didn't see walleye full of gobies. Now, we're seeing gobies literally disappear out of our trawl survey. They're not out in open waters anymore because they're being so utilized by channel catfish, yellow perch, walleye, smallmouth, even largemouth that are near shore and around the harbors. Everything's eating gobies, and we're seeing the size distribution shrink and the numbers shrink because so many things utilize them.
So I'm going to put you on the spot because all this stuff is, I eat it up. This is what I do. I love knowing all of these things. And again, you take some of it with a grain of salt, but you're taking the best information you have at the time. But as a guy that, fished in tournaments, fishes quite a bit, own your own boat, do all the stuff, and you're out there trying to catch them yourself, where can, guy sitting at home, guy listening to this right now, working out at the gym, whatever it is, what really can you take, because almost all of this information is available, right? And this is public information.
Yep.
You may have to dig a little bit, but this is all stuff you can get. You don't have, this isn't secret or anything like this. This is government deal. This is what you do. And how can a guy, or how do you take some of this information to make yourself a better fisherman? Because again, all these numbers and migration, that's great. But when you cut the bullshit out, what can you really do you think, to make yourself a better fisherman?
I've thought about that a lot, both for presentations as part of work, but obviously, how do I become a better angler from what I know? And I think it's a little specific to Lake Erie, but some of the strategies would apply to other smaller inland lakes too. But you really have to think about what the fish are doing and what that dictates that they're keying in on, what they're eating. So Ross, you think about the spring, it's the one time where you have more fish than the local prey resources would support long term. So you have males all over the reefs for 2 months. You have large females transitioning to small females all around the reefs. They're there to spawn, right? They're not there to eat. They're not there because of the prey. So you're just trying to find the right marks, the right water temperature. You're looking for the right conditions. You're not looking for prey. You're looking for where the right fish are in the right conditions. Fast forward to later in the year, in the summer, July, August, September, I'm looking for that prey. Because if I'm out in open water, I know walleye are doing nothing but following prey around and eating it. So I'm looking for the bait fish on my sonar. I'm looking for the groups of bait to fish around the edges of them and near them. That's what I would suggest.
One of the best quotes, and I use it in seminars all the time, it was given to me by a mentor, and taught me a lot of the game from Bemidji, Minnesota, Dave Hansen. Maybe a name that a lot of guys don't know, but I can tell you he's one of the best fishermen I've ever been around. Gary Roach said he's probably the best fisher, walleye guy that he knows. He had a knack of finding them, and he was one of those guys that always was ahead of everybody, on the curve. And I said, Dave, how do you kind of like what we just said, how do we do this? And he's a pretty simple guy. He said, Ross, he said, this really comes down to it. He said, fish don't go far from the grocery store.
Very true.
And again, these things, we're looking for these complex answers. But like you said, if you can't find the walleyes, just look for the food, because eventually they're going to be together.
Absolutely.
And if they aren't looking to eat, then it's probably not, those aren't, if they're glued to the bottom of 50 foot, not that those fish won't hit, but you probably want those fish that are suspended chasing that gizzard shad or emerald shiners or whatever it may be, right? You're going for the easy target.
Yep. And you think about it, so much of it comes back to knowing what you're using your sonar for. So when I'm fishing open water, I'm not fishing a white screen. I'm not fishing history, just going to a spot and saying, well, I caught him here last year. If I go out there and the screen's white, well, I'm going to keep going. You got to know what
find the biomass.
Find the prey, find the big walleye hooks around them. You're out in open water, you're looking for bait fish or predator cues. Now, if you're fishing structure, what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for probably for certain depths, certain bottom types.
That's a little trickier deal.
It is.
That's almost a talk within itself. And I'm not going to give you so much, but I think the reality is one tip that I would give somebody though that I don't know if it applies everywhere, but on a majority of the Great Lakes that I fish, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, is when you're fishing a screen that looks too good to be true. Now maybe it's a little different now because of what we'll talk about in a second with the hatches and stuff. But I don't know how many times I've seen guys, and a lot of it's electronics, so they don't know what they're doing. Just be honest, guys. But you see a screen that's just insane. If you aren't getting any bites, I like to get out of that because I think that some of those are gizzard shad. I think that they're whitefish. They're other things. So sometimes getting away, not completely, but hitting those pockets. Like I had that last week where I'm just looking at the screen. I'm like, they gotta be gizzard shad or whitefish or something else that's kind of grouped up here, because when you're running 6-8 lines through them and you're not catching anything, either you really suck, which could be an option for some of us, but in reality, I don't know how many times that I, like last 2 out of 3 trips that I went and I got out of that a little bit, somewhat unintentionally, but I just kept going instead of turning back around or getting back in that, and boom, we started just rocking them. So you don't have to have a full screen, but you want some life, as you said.
Yeah. Well, you think about it, if you and I were sitting here and eating, we wouldn't have our plates on top of each other, smacking elbows against each other.
Not with a skinny guy.
If you're eating, you need room. You need to be able to hunt and attack that prey. I've always felt like the best marks on a sonar are those big upside down hooks that are spread out. If you have 10 of them on the screen at one time, I don't think they're feeding. It might be that they're another species, but it might just be that they're inactive walleye that are okay with being close to each other because they're inactive. Maybe the water's a little dirtier, they feel a little safer, and they're all piled in there just hanging out. If they're actively feeding, I don't want to see more than 2 or 3 hooks on the screen at the same time. Those are the best marks, the big spread out marks.
And we won't take Dr. Sonar or high tech fishing to let him handle this stuff. But the reality is when you got that triangle like this and you mark 20 fish here, you got to remember 6 fish up here is equivalent to that same amount because that scope that you're covering. So just because you don't see a pile of them, I think that's, if we had to give somebody a simple tip, is don't fish too deep.
Yeah.
I mean,
you want to be above them.
You want them to come up. Sometimes I think you get them to commit by coming up, but the reality is, like I said, if you see 20% up above, the reality is it's probably the same amount of numbers stacked in that column. We just don't realize it because of the limited blinders that you have on per se. But
it's really difficult, isn't it, trying to visualize a 3-dimensional cone on a 2-dimensional screen and thinking about what that means and how deep the fish are. But it all comes back to screen time, right? The longer you stare at it, the more comfortable you get with what your results will be based on what you're seeing.
We both gave a seminar at a club not that long ago, and that was kind of the thing. And I could just see people looking at me like, man, he's full of shit, But I'm comfortable. I know what my stuff is. And like I said, I've seen guys on Facebook that, and again, only because I know I saw them out there, and they're like, oh man, look at this thing. And I know they were chasing white bass because they had their sensitivity at like 97%. Right. You can make a bluegill on these screens look like a mongo if you want. I mean, you can make an ice jig, in the wintertime look like it's a giant. And a lot of these guys, they aren't fishing the right stuff. They don't have, I don't know if they don't have the experience or they just don't have the confidence or they just flat out don't have their stuff set up. I mean, there's enough, I use Humminbird personally, but there's enough manufacturers out there. They make a good product now. And as we get into side imaging, now all of a sudden we're starting to see that bigger scope and we're seeing more of those suspended fish. And, guys around here, I mean, sometimes our fishing's a lot easier than other places. So when you get these guys that come from other places, a good buddy of mine from South Dakota, he's seeing him take a different approach to it. It kind of is like, even though I had great success with what I'm doing, you kind of go, there's sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes you need to kind of think outside the box a little bit or be open-minded.
But so we could probably sit here and talk about sonars all day. Both of us are kind of sonar nerds, I would argue. I didn't used to use side scan at all on Lake Erie. I might use multiple frequencies, but I'm using traditional sonar to find fish while I'm running and, confirm while I'm trolling that I'm still on them. And I started turning the side scan on while I'm trolling just because you got the screen space, there's only so much you need while you're trolling. And I started realizing, that right side of the boat, I'm getting all my hits right now. Side scan says there's not a fish over on the left side of the boat. Now, obviously, that changes 5 minutes down the road. All of a sudden, you just happen to go through a patch and they're all on the left side of the boat.
But that doesn't mean you don't turn to the right.
Oh, absolutely. So, you just react to what you're seeing. Man, I got a lot of fish on that side. Those boards are getting hit. Maybe I have to sneak a little bit that way. But I used to think there was more to it. Like that side's getting hit because I got the right lures, or maybe current is right for that angle from the boat. Turns out it's where the fish are. And the sonar, all these clues we have with sonar, you start to see why the things that are happening.
And I think that the thing we're having now is you can be wrong, but be right. Because again, let's talk about these hatch numbers.
Yep.
The last 3 years, you look at these, we could probably even get a chart from you, we'll probably put one up or something.
Sure.
When you look at these bar charts or whatever, and you go, okay, here's a hatch,
Yep.
just tell us what we've had here in the last few years.
In the last 5 years, we've seen 3 of the biggest hatches we've ever had. So 2015 was the first really big one since 03. 2003 is kind of the one we measure stuff against.
That's what everybody talks about.
Yep. And it's kind of funny. You look back historically, the 80s were really unique. We didn't have the giant hatches, but we had consistent every year, big hatch with today's standards. And then we came out of it and stopped getting them. And we got 03, and it really saved the fishery because we were in a bad place in 03 and then got this giant hatch, biggest we've ever seen. And that became the measuring stick. And, in our office, we all kind of assumed we're not going to see the 80s again. The 80s were really unique. It was an awesome time. Now we just got to hope for a handful of these big hatches to keep carrying us through the
Bad
next
music,
one.
though, in my opinion.
Right. And it's, as an angler, it's frustrating because you want the 80s, right? We want to be back there.
I don't want the 80s.
The numbers of fish standpoint.
Oh, just from a fish standpoint. Okay. Yeah.
So all of a sudden we get 2015. It's like, wow, we got a really good one, and we got one even better than 03. Whoever thought that would happen again? And then all of a sudden in 18 and 19, it happens all over again both years. We're looking at 3 03 level hatches in 15, 18, and 19.
Now, again, you don't have to be a scientist to kind of follow some of these trends. When we've had ice, we tend to have a better spawn.
So that was historically that was the characterization. If you get a hard winter, if you get lots of ice, and more importantly, even late ice. So like you look back at 03, it wasn't a hard winter as most people would call it, but it was late. I don't know if you remember, that was my first spring up here. We had icebergs floating around in late March. Got a big hatch. Well, then you look at 15, it followed that pattern again, right? We had one of our harder winters, great ice fishing year, best we've had in a long time. Got a big hatch. Then 18 and 19 roll around, and we don't have a winter, and we get to the biggest hatches we've ever seen.
We had ice; it just wasn't great fishing ice.
Right, and it wasn't ice that lasted until mid or late March. We had 60 degrees in February. I think both Februarys in 18 and 19, at least for a brief period of time. But what happened, what I think is really important, is we had miserable Marches. I don't know how much you tried to fish March the last 2 years. I'm sure you were trying, but it was miserable. And functionally what happened is spawning got delayed. We didn't have eggs dropped until April.
So do you think on those years when we have that hard, it just forces, one of the theories I've heard is that it forces the fish to spawn in a smaller window and not drug out?
What we see with walleye is they absolutely react to conditions. So if you have warm weather in March and early open water and higher water temperatures, they'll spawn in March. They react. They move their spawning up and spawn if conditions are right.
Was it like 2011 in February? It was like 80 degrees.
Yeah, and you look back, that was one of our worst hatches.
Shocker.
They moved early. They spawned when conditions seemed right, and it ended up being a bad hatch. These last 2 years, even though we didn't have a hard winter, we didn't have late ice, we got miserable Marches. They held off till April to spawn, and it ended up functionally like a hard winter as far as spawning goes.
So let's go there with the water levels. Like right now, you look down there as we speak. They're building up the docks at the ferries because at one point, can't get the boats in because there's no water. Now we can't get them in because it's a vertical climb to get up the ramp. So, I can remember marinas back in the day. You could walk across them. The wind would blow out a certain direction, and there'd be nothing but mud.
Yep.
And now we've got them where houses are losing stuff and going all over, and you go, what the heck? So, from a fishing standpoint, I know it increases the currents. I've seen that. Yeah. I've seen drownings increase, unfortunately. Sure. But what else is going on that you can correlate?
I think it's our best comparison to the 80s. So I mentioned, the 80s were kind of the golden time, and we had lots of fish and productivity and big hatches. We had really high water. That's what was similar in the 80s to what we're experiencing right now. Now that we've seen that water level come back, I think it gives you a larger window to get a good hatch. So, maybe there's more plankton blooming over a longer period of time because of higher water levels and high productivity. So all of a sudden, even if the spawn timing isn't perfect or the number of this hatch isn't as high as some of the bigger years, everything survives. All of a sudden you have high survival because you have a lot of plankton. Maybe the current, you mentioned current changing, maybe more fish are making it into that nursery habitat that's so important. So high water might just mean more inshore flow for whatever reason, and you get more larvae near shore where it's warm and productive.
So again, back to the biology stuff is great. I'm troubled by it. What else do you think really, though, makes a difference that you can take? So like you said, we started talking about this, that you take your information that you have that makes you a better fisherman, or that you could relay to somebody, or somebody can go on all these available government sites and pull this information that actually makes them a better fisherman.
Yeah. I think it all comes back to...
That's not an easy one, I know.
I know it's not, but I know we have to think about ourselves and what we do, and so starting with the before you go out, obviously you have probably a small network of friends you trust that you get information from and share with. What's your starting point? So maybe I look at the internet boards, maybe I look at where most of the fishing reports are coming from. So there's my first point of information. Now you have all the information that we have, like what we summarize our harvest. So you can look over the past 20 years and say it's just a May trip. Where in May have fish been harvested for the past 20 years? Well, I can look at a grid map and see, holy cow, the island area is one of our highest harvest areas in May. Now all of a sudden I've seen fishing reports from around Kelly's Island and they're good. I know historically lots of fish get caught around Kelly's Island in May. And then I can think about the conditions. Well, was this year early spring or late spring? What are the females doing relative to the spawn? Let's see, I had a hard winter. Spawning probably started late. I probably have big females around Kelly's in May now because of the environmental conditions from this year. I don't know where high water fits right into that exactly from a fishing standpoint, but am I going to fish open water migrators, or am I fishing structure fish near shore that might still be spawning? Well, water depth change from the last year might change where I was fishing last year.
So leave me with the one tip. I know they're stupid to even say this, but occasionally you get that one thing, that you think that can make, we've had a bunch of guys on here and they all have something that's kind of like your one thing. What is the one thing that you could say that could make somebody a better fisherman? I mean, a lot of mine are simple things that we know, but we don't do.
I think it flat out comes down, it's that connection to the sonar I was talking about earlier. Don't fish where there aren't fish. And that's more important on Erie than it is any water body in the world. History might tell you where they might be. It might put you in the best chance without any on the water knowledge. Don't fish until you see what you need to see on that sonar. If I'm in open water, I've got to see bait or walleye or both. If I'm fishing structure, I better find the right bottom type and depth that I believe the walleye will be in. Don't fish where there aren't fish, and let your sonar tell you where that is.
So what you're saying is that you can't catch them where they aren't.
I'm confident of that. Of everything I've said today, I'm most confident of that.
Well, I'm going to say this because about, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was getting ready to go on stage doing a little spiel, and there was some apparently smart-ass guy who was in his little state uniform, and he said, "Oh, look, I've waited 20 years to open for Ross Robertson on a seminar." And I've been just holding that dear right here. So I'm glad that we didn't have to wait too long to have you co-host on this podcast, and I appreciate your time. And it's, a lot of the stuff it's kind of boring, let's be honest. But the reality is these are things that really do help you understand what's going on.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it's just the little things that you pick out, just like fishing, that become the big things in reality. So
when you think about that, Ross, I was thinking at the time that was a pinnacle of my career. I mean, what else could I achieve?
I would argue that it was.
And now I'm even farther along in my career and I've done this. I don't know where I have to go. I'm not sure what I have to aspire to after this. I
haven't even decided if this is going to run yet. I mean, I'm kind of kicking that back and forth, but I mean, there's some legalities maybe involved. But we appreciate your time and insight. And is there any sites or anything you can give guys to go to? We can put them up and link them and things, but anything where somebody can go to get some of this information that we referenced.
If you search for the Ohio DNR Division of Wildlife, you'll get to our division page, and you can seek out fisheries information on that page. I got to tell you, a lot of this stuff is dry. We have an annual report that you reference. You can find this information online. It's all there, and it's all there in a book that's about this thick, full of tables and numbers and charts. But it's a starting point. If you want to look up sport fishing catch, you can look at our angler survey tables and see where fish get caught through the years. But that's all available on our website. I'm more than happy if you call or email our Sandusky office, which you can find information for on our website. If you're looking for something specific, send us an email or give us a call, and we'll help you get in touch with that information.
The only thing more fun than talking about fishing is actually doing it. So get out there, do it. Take a kid, get out there. Don't sit and wait. You can't catch them if you don't go.
Take your dad, take your kids, take your relatives, take them all.
You can't catch them on the couch. Some of my best days are days that nobody wanted to go. With that, we out. Thanks for joining us at the Bigwater podcast. To hear the shenanigans, look at all the old episodes that we've done, check us out at YouTube, bigwaterfishing.com, and of course follow us at Instagram and Facebook. Bigwater Fishing. That's what we're doing.